We're going to get started. Sorry, we're a little late, but we're going to move forward. We have an hour for lunch, so if we go a little over here, I'm sure none of you are used to an hour lunch, so you can adjust to 45 minutes. Thank you all for coming. I'm a former county office employee in the special ed department and just volunteering today at the Inclusion Collaborative because I've been fighting for inclusion since I started at the county office. I don't even want to tell you when, but it was over 40 years ago. So I'd like to introduce I'd like to introduce Sam Drazin. He is the founder and executive director of Changing Perspectives. He began his career in his home state of Vermont, and his experiences both as a student with a disability and a teacher working in an inclusive classroom helped him recognize the importance of supporting students in establishing and developing essential life and relationship skills that underpin equity, inclusion, and social change. Sam, when did the Inclusion Collaborative start? I mean, CP? Yes. Yeah, I was going to say 10, it's been going on for 10 years. And I am lucky to be on their board of directors. So I'm really familiar with Sam and their work that happens across the United States. Sam has moved to California, so we have from Vermont, so we have better access to him, and Sam and Changing Perspectives do amazing work. So I'll let him get started.
Thanks. All right. I don't have to do anything. You already clapped. We're done. Take 2 hours for lunch. You see? So just to make sure you're in the right place, this is an integrated approach to inclusion in SEL. So if this is not the workshop you meant to be in, you're here now, or you can find someplace else to go. But really excited to be here. I know we are starting a little bit late, so I'm going to kind of go through the slides in maybe a little bit of a faster pace than I anticipated, because I do want to make sure that there's time at the end for question and answer. They gave me 2 clickers, so I'm not sure which one is working. Oh, there we go. So as Kathy said, my name is Sam Drazin. I am a former elementary educator. So shout out to any elementary school teachers in here. I taught 3rd grade and 5th grade. Also a person with a disability. And I now serve as the founder and executive director of a national nonprofit called Changing Perspectives. I've put my email address up here on the screen. You are more than welcome to reach out to me after today's session. This is a Google slide deck. I'm more than happy to share it with you. If you want to hop on a call and talk more about how I and Changing Perspectives can support your school, that is there, as well as social media links. Little bit more about Changing Perspectives. We are a national 501c3 nonprofit organization. Really, our central work is partnering and collaborating with schools and districts to support their work in creating more equitable, inclusive learning communities. We really do our work through the lens of students with disabilities, but ultimately I see this as tier 1 intervention. This is UDL at its core. Whatever we do to create a more inclusive learning community for our students who might receive special education services is ultimately going to support all students. How do we do our work? We have a SEL and what we call a disability awareness curriculum, pre-K through high school. We work with schools to provide individualized and customizable coaching and professional development trainings. We also look to support schools in engaging families in the conversation as well. Website is up here. Feel free to follow us on social media as well. We try not to just post about what we're doing, but also post resources that could be helpful for you. So now that you know a little bit about me and the work that I come from, let's really jump in to today's conversation. So an integrated approach to SEL and inclusion. A lot of times in schools, we hear about social emotional learning focused on the gen ed population. And then we hear about inclusion and special ed over here. And very rarely do they overlap. And what I hope that I can do today is help you see all of the connections that already exist between the work we're doing when it comes to inclusion and inclusive practices and the work we're doing within social emotional learning. So we've got 4 parts of our agenda today. First, I want to define social emotional learning and inclusion because those are both buzzwords. They're both very, very vague. And we've got a lot of people here from lots of different schools. And I bet every school has a different approach, definition, understanding of SEL and inclusion. So before we talk about the connections and the intersectionalities, let's make sure we have a common understanding. Then I want to share with you some specific strategies that you can use on your site to really more intentionally integrate the two. And I'm hopefully going to get through that fast enough so we have time for Q&A. But again, you all have my contact information, so you're welcome to reach out to me after if you have questions as well. So we can't start any SEL conversation without an SEL activity. So what I would like to do is start with a quick breathing exercise. There's lots of names for it. You're probably familiar with it. I call it the 5-finger breathing exercise. I see some friends up front already starting, but for those of you who don't know what it is, here's what I'd like you to do. Pick one hand, doesn't matter, hold it up, show all 5 fingers. The other hand, I'm supposed to hold the microphone because it's connecting to our virtual audience here. So your other hand, take your index finger, start it at the bottom of your thumb. As we run our index finger up our thumb, we're going to inhale. And as we run it down our thumb, we're going to exhale. And we're going to repeat that for the remaining 4 fingers. So hopefully if we had a little bit of a hectic morning, we felt like we were rushing around, we feel a little more regulated, present in this space. And if you aren't familiar with the 5-finger breathing exercise, now you have a new strategy you can use at school with your students. What I love about it is it takes about 5 seconds. You need no materials. You can do it any place. So let's start by defining some terms. These are kind of my definitions. I don't think there is one sole definition of SEL or inclusion. I think it really depends on the community at which you're supporting. But these are my definitions. SEL is a set of transferable universal skills we use throughout our entire lives. Right? At its core, they are skills that students will be able to apply in school, outside of school, in 1st grade, in 6th grade, in college, on the soccer field, at the workplace. They are those universal skills that they are transferring from one environment to another. What is inclusion? I think we have to be really thoughtful when we define inclusion, because each of the different components of inclusion, or each of the different verbs in this definition, means something different. So here's one definition. Inclusion is where all students have equal access, the authentic ability to participate, and feel a sense of belonging. We have access, we're able to participate, but we also belong. Those are all 3 very, very different things. I'm going to show you a quick little video to unpack this definition of SEL a bit more.
There's a lot of talk these days about SEL, social emotional learning. But what exactly is it? Social emotional learning is the process of learning social and emotional skills, and it's just as important as learning reading or math. This learning process is most effective when it begins early and continues through high school. Social emotional skills are essential for success in school, work, and life. With SEL, students learn to manage their own emotions and behaviors, have empathy and show care and concern for others, solve problems effectively, make responsible decisions, and maintain healthy relationships. Students learn to recognize what's happening inside them and to be aware of their emotions, which helps them deal with strong emotions and impulsive behaviors. It helps them stop, take a breath, and think about a situation before acting. Students learn to identify others' emotions and perspectives, which helps them empathize and show compassion, no matter who they are or what their background is. It's not difficult to imagine how this is important in the classroom and in life. Students learn to solve problems in peaceful ways and communicate assertively about what they need or want. This helps them get along with other students and get the help they need from adults. When students learn to make responsible decisions about their lives and their future, things can turn out better. Research shows social emotional learning makes a difference. Students who participate in SEL do better academically, have improved attitudes and behaviors, and act in delinquent or disruptive ways less often. In the United States, students with strong social emotional competence are twice as likely to earn a college degree and nearly 50% more likely to graduate from high school and have a full-time job by age 25. Just as important, students who are socially and emotionally competent have more friends. This means they're more likely to feel connected to school and do well, and less likely to be left out or bullied. Simply put, by participating in social emotional learning, students learn the skills to succeed in every facet of school and the rest of their lives.
So let's break this down a little bit more. So there's an organization called CASTLE that you might be familiar with. That's the logo up here. It stands for the Collaborative of Academic and Social Emotional Learning. What I want to share with you is their framework for SEL, which really is the most universal. And even here in the state of California, they have at the CDE, the Transformative SEL Division, and they have their own SEL standards that really align closely with these. Because again, we've got to we have to make sure we know what we're talking about. We say things like SEL. Some folks just think, oh, that's like Kumbaya by the fire. It's just anti-bullying. It's just teaching kindness. It's just that one day a year that we have Unity Day. That's our SEL. And if we think about that series of transferable and universal skills that we use throughout our entire lives, those skills can be divided up into these 5 different competencies or domains. And in our educational system, we love putting things in boxes, right? We love schedules. We love, from 8 to 8:30, it's morning meeting, and 8:30 to 9, it's ELA, and 9 to 9:15, it's snack, right? And so this is a way to kind of take this really big concept and start to compartmentalize it. So within social emotional learning, essentially what we're looking to do is support students' self-awareness. And within self-awareness, there's a series of specific skills, concepts, ideas, such as recognizing what are my strengths, what are my challenges, helping us understand our emotions, creating a greater sense of identity and our sense of purpose in the world. So I like to think about self-awareness as the adjectives that we help students articulate about who they are. The next section is self-management. Self-management are the verbs. Now that we have the adjectives to describe who I am, how I'm feeling, what's my sense of identity and purpose, how do I take that knowledge about who I am and put that into action to live a successful life. So within self-management, we're helping students manage their emotions, whether that's through stress management strategies, etc. But it's also about goal setting, learning how to take initiative, learning how to organize yourself, have that kind of intrinsic motivation to be successful. So we've got self-awareness, which are the adjectives about me, self-management, which are the verbs about how I act. When we jump to social awareness, we're broadening the lens, we're broadening that perspective. We're moving away from the self and more about building that awareness of others. So social awareness is where we get into things like empathy, perspective taking, showing concern for others, recognizing when we're grateful for something and showing gratitude for others. It's about understanding diverse social norms. What are the behavioral and social expectations for me in different places and spaces that I might be going to? And considering various cultural backgrounds. So again, you're probably starting to think, hopefully, how inclusion connects with SEL, right? When we have diverse learners in the classroom, on the playground, in the cafeteria together, we create a natural playground for students to develop empathy, for students to explore perspectives of others, for students to show concern for others. Now, when we get to relationship skills, we're really helping our students define and articulate what is a healthy relationship. We're helping them communicate effectively, learn that not all students communicate with voice. There's lots of ways that we can communicate. We're helping students learn how to work as a team to problem solve. And you may be working with students that communicate differently, that have different strengths, that have different needs. We're looking at how do we resolve conflicts? How do we become a leader? I believe every student has the opportunity to be a leader, but not all students are a leader in the same way. You could be a student who lives with dyslexia, so maybe you're not a leader during Reader's Workshop, but maybe you're a star on the basketball court, and that's where you're the leader. So it's recognizing, where am I a leader? And then this is a huge part of inclusion, being able to be a self-advocate. Going back to self-awareness, I know what my challenges, I know what my needs are. I can advocate for myself to be successful. And then on the flip side, helping others when others need support. I know what my strengths are. I know how I can support others. And then when we get to decision making, we're helping our students think about, when you're faced with a decision, how do you work through evaluating the pros and cons of your choices? How do you consider how a choice that you make doesn't just affect you in that moment, but it affects others around you? How can you, and especially for some of our middle school students, this could be hard, how can you predict the consequences, whether that consequence is negative or positive, of your decisions? So in that relatively fast review of SEL, hopefully you are starting to think about this natural intersection between the skills, concepts within these 5 areas of SEL and what we're ultimately trying to do when we create an inclusive learning community. When we create an inclusive learning community, we're trying to ensure that all students feel like they belong. Social awareness, relationship skills. When we create an inclusive learning community, we're trying to ensure that our students with differences feel empowered to be their own best self-advocate. Self-management. We're trying to create an inclusive learning community where students maybe without differences are the inclusive change makers for tomorrow, right? Inclusion doesn't need to always be facilitated by the adults. And in fact, that's actually pretty exhausting. How can we as adults create a community and environment where the students are facilitating those inclusive opportunities. So now that we have some general common knowledge and understanding about SEL, let's jump to defining inclusion. So again, SEL, a set of transferable universal skills we use throughout our entire lives, organized in these 5 areas with a series of specific skills and concepts within each domain. Inclusion, like SEL, I think is kind of a buzzword right now. And it's this really vague, kind of large, broad topic. And it can be hard to wrap our mind around it unless we start to unpack it. So just like I took SEL and I organized it into those 5 areas, for inclusion, we can organize inclusion into 3 areas. So when I think about, and the work that I do in schools, I help schools unpack this. In a school community, we can focus in these 3 areas of inclusion. We have academic inclusion. So that is thinking about access to content. That's thinking about academic participation. That's thinking about ensuring all students feel a sense of academic achievement. We can have physical inclusion. And a lot of times when I mention physical inclusion, I think we jump to ADA, like, oh, do we have an elevator? Do we have a ramp? This and that. I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about flexible seating. Do we organize our classrooms so all students can be successful there as long as possible? I'm thinking about sensory inputs for success. We know students who live on the spectrum or who've experienced trauma. It could be a specific smell. It could be a sound. It could be a tactile touch that triggers them, right? And then they're triggered, and then we ask them to leave. Or we create an exclusive learning community. So it's thinking about those things. If we know we have fidgety kids, let's put resistance bands on the front 2 legs of the chair so they can push their legs about it, back and forth. If we know we have students who get easily distracted by loud noises, can we provide noise canceling headphones? Ensuring that we have our classrooms where there's places for students to work independently in a group setting, that we have some sort of calming corner of sorts. So physical inclusion is way more than just ADA compliance. It's walking into all of the places and spaces on our campus and going, okay, can all students be here and be successful for as long as possible? And then all of a sudden you stand there and you're like, you know how sometimes their classrooms have the tile floors and the chairs, and you move the chair and it makes that loud squeaking noise, right? Can we put tennis balls on the bottom of this chair? So simple little things like that. Social inclusion. Social inclusion is where we get to creating a sense of belonging. Do we explicitly teach our students what's inclusive play, or if you're at the middle or at the high school level, you might not call it play, inclusive socializing or hanging out or chilling or whatever they say now, vibing, I think that's the word. Do we explicitly teach them what does inclusive social interactions look like, sound like, and feel like at our site? A lot of times we say things like include everyone, don't exclude, be nice. Our definition of what those things look like in practice is often very different than students. And we just assume or we expect them to like read our mind and do certain things. So social inclusion, have we taught them that? Are all staff members versed in how to facilitate social play? A lot of times what I see is we've got teachers or school counselors or whomever who are in the classroom, maybe leading the SEL lesson. And then they go out to the playground and there's yard supervisors who weren't there for the lesson. And now all of a sudden, the people who are teaching the skills aren't out there to facilitate the practice of the skills. Common language is huge. Let me give you an example. We did the 5-finger breathing exercise. That 5-finger breathing exercise has like a dozen other names. So here's an example. You're a student in a classroom. The teacher is saying, okay, well, when we're feeling really those big emotions, we're feeling escalated or whatever, you could do your 5-finger breathing exercise. Okay, fast forward. Student is outside at recess and is upset about something and they're feeling big emotions. And they go to their yard supervisor because they're upset. And the yard supervisor says, do your whole hand breathing. And the student goes, I don't know what whole hand breathing is. Now the yard supervisor says, well, now you're being disrespectful. Go to the office, right? That whole thing could have been resolved if the people monitoring recess had the same language that the students were being taught in the classroom. So just like I showed you a short video to further explain and articulate our definition of SEL, I want to show you a short video to further explain and define inclusion.
Everyone is different. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education believes that education is strongest when it embraces diversity. Learners should not have to adapt to the system. Instead, education systems should adapt to their needs. When students do not feel welcome in school, they are less likely to learn. This is everyone's loss. But rich and poor countries too often educate some children apart. Children who have a disability, have been displaced, speak a different language, or are poor and disadvantaged. School design may favor some students over others, as do many laws and policies. Teachers are often ill-equipped to cater for students' diverse needs. Children may not recognize the way they are portrayed in textbooks. Some may not see themselves there at all. They receive the message that they do not belong. Testing sometimes follows a narrow vision of education, and consequently, some students leave education earlier than they should. These are complex problems to solve, but a belief in the right to education is a belief in inclusion. Children have different learning speeds and needs. They need curricula that are flexible, creative, and relevant. How we prepare teachers matters. They must be given the tools and training to achieve our vision for reform. The resources we know can help the marginalized, educators, support staff, and equipment should be shared so that everyone can benefit. Better data on those left behind will help us reach them. Disadvantages often accumulate. We can't address inclusion one group at a time. Redressing these disadvantages requires funds. These must be equitable and target individual-specific needs. We must work together on these tasks across government ministries, from central to local authorities, with civil society supporting governments, and schools opening doors to the community. Inclusion in education requires a change in mindset in society, so that education for all means education for everyone without an exception. Achieving this is everybody's business, including yours.
All right. So we've done the first part of the agenda here. We've defined SEL, a set of transferable universal skills we use throughout our entire lives. We unpacked that rather vague and broad definition by talking about a set of skills, concepts that fit in 5 areas: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. We then defined inclusion, creating places and spaces where students can access content, participate in the experience, and create a sense of belonging. We further unpacked inclusion by talking about inclusion in 3 different ways: academic inclusion, physical inclusion, and social inclusion. So now what I want us to do is start to think about and make connections for the ways in which the work we're doing around SEL and inclusion and inclusive practices are really one. They're really married. We have to think about how can we get our own mindset to shift? How can we help the mindset of other people shift to take these two kind of silos and put them together as one? All right. Inclusion. If we want inclusion to be authentic and valuable and successful, inclusion happens everywhere, in all of the places and spaces on your school site. Inclusion does not just happen in this one classroom. That's not inclusion. Inclusion is creating access, participation, and belonging in the classroom, in the cafeteria, on the playground, on the school bus, etc. But guess what? SEL happens everywhere too, folks. SEL does not just happen from 9 to 9:30 on Tuesday mornings when that's when you're assigned to teach SEL. Students are constantly practicing, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, but they are constantly practicing those SEL skills everywhere. So if we're striving to ensure that access, participation, and belonging for all students happens everywhere, we're striving to ensure that students have a chance to practice self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, decision-making, and relationships everywhere. Why aren't we thinking about doing this together? All right, you ready for the next? In order for inclusion to be successful, we have to educate, engage, and inspire all of our community stakeholders. We're supporting educators by giving them tools and strategies. And by educators, I'm also thinking cafeteria workers, yard supervisors, secretaries in the front office, right? We're educating, engaging, and inspiring all of the adults in a school that work and support students. We're also supporting our students. We're empowering them with the skills they need to be the change makers of tomorrow. We're empowering them with the self-advocacy skills so they can speak for themselves. We also have to ensure that we're engaging families in this conversation. We're encouraging them to engage. We're educating them on the what, the why, and the how behind this work. And guess what? We're doing all of this for SEL. We're also doing all of this for inclusion. Parents need support at home on how to help their students regulate their big emotions. Parents are also in the IP meeting, right? Our teachers need to learn how to differentiate curriculum. Our teachers might also be the ones teaching our SEL lessons. So we have to think about how SEL and inclusion are happening everywhere in all the places and spaces in our schools. And all of our stakeholders are involved in both of this work. So again, I challenge you to think about why, oopsie, going the wrong way. Why have we for so long isolated these two things in two buckets when there's so much intersections, so many intersections? All right. SEL is an example of UDL. Inclusion is an example of UDL. They're both examples of UDL. This is all tier one. We're supporting all students with this work. One of the best ways that I like to describe this idea of benefits for all or universal design for learning, right, is when we tweak, augment, modify, or accommodate in a different way, maybe for 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 students. Ultimately, it's going to help all students. So the example of that is what's called the curb effect. So the curb effect is how our sidewalks dip down. So there's a little bit of a ramp to a crosswalk. The curb effect was a result of ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, to ensure that individuals who use wheelchairs were able to get from the sidewalk to the crosswalk. All right. So a little shift in the way that we build our sidewalks to dip down to the crosswalk. Take a minute to think about all the other people that the curb effect makes crosswalks more accessible for. Individuals pushing strollers, people on bikes, scooters, little kids who are just learning how to walk so it doesn't feel like such a big step down. Older people who might be using a cane, people delivering packages. That one very small shift and change in the way that we build our sidewalks to go to our crosswalks that was designed to help one group of individuals who fit under the physical disability category of IDEA, it helps everyone. So let's get a little more specific now. Here's a recap. SEL and inclusion, they are both, or should both, be happening in all places and spaces on your school campus. SEL and inclusion support all capital ALL students, both with and without a disability. SEL and inclusion can be taught explicitly and inexplicitly. And we're going to talk about what that means in just a moment. And here's the really funny thing is that when you do SEL, it promotes inclusion kind of organically. And when you do inclusion, it promotes SEL organically. So how does inclusion specifically promote social emotional growth for all students? When we have students of varying abilities, languages, cultures, etc., learning and playing together, it allows us to naturally create opportunities for students to build empathy and learn how to take the perspective of another person. It's really hard to build empathy for or take the perspective of another person if everybody that you're around has the same perspective that you do. When we have students learning and playing together of varying abilities, it gives them the opportunity to learn how to collaborate in different ways. When you're in a group of people, whether that's a game, whether that's a sports team, whether that's a school assignment or project, you need to lean on each other's strengths. You need to be self-aware as SEL. You need to be self-aware about what your strengths are, what you bring to the group or the team. It helps students learn about communication. We don't all communicate by our voice. Some of us communicate more by our body language. Some of us might communicate using an augmented communication device. Some of us speak different languages. One of the really cool things I think about inclusion is that when we start talking about how we're different, we usually end talking about how we're the same. So this doesn't just help us realize our differences and celebrate that. It helps us simultaneously recognize and celebrate our similarities. SEL is not stagnant. I like to think about SEL in two different buckets: proactive SEL and reactive SEL. Proactive SEL is when your school is using, whether it's Second Step or Leader in Me or Caring School Communities or some curriculum, let's say, where you have a structured time, once a week, once a month, whatever it is, where you're teaching a specific SEL lesson or skill, right? So that is proactive SEL. That is the explicit teaching of a skill. We also have what I call reactive SEL. Reactive SEL are all those other times during the school day where students are practicing those skills and the adults are responsible for facilitating the opportunities for students to practice and then reflecting with students after, whether their practice goes well or sometimes not so well. So SEL could be thought of in those two ways. Proactive, explicit teaching, where we kind of have our scope and sequence, and those reactive opportunities where we're helping students practice those skills. Now, you probably won't be surprised if you've been paying attention or understanding the pattern of this presentation, that inclusion is the same thing. I call it something different just to sound cool and fancy, but it's the same thing. With inclusion, I like to think about it as intentional inclusion and unintentional inclusion. So here's what I mean by that. Intentional inclusion is when we as educators do things intentionally to promote inclusive opportunities. So that might be the way we design our classroom. That might be the grouping of students. That might be differentiating curriculum content, right? So those are intentional things that we do to ensure that students, I'm going to go back to that definition, have access, can participate, and feel as though they belong. That would be intentional inclusion. So that is similar to the proactive SEL. Unintentional inclusion is similar to the reactive SEL. That's when students, unprompted by an adult, make a choice that is inclusive. Okay, so outside at recess is a really great example, right? So intentional inclusion would be an adult at recess who notices a student has no one to play with. So they go to a student who has kids to play with and go ask that student to play with you. That would be intentional inclusion. Unintentional inclusion is the goal. That's where we want to go, right? That is student A having, guess what? Social awareness, SEL, looking around the playground and going, oh, that kid looks a little sad. I'm going to go up and ask them to play with me and my friends. SEL, we're explicit, but we're also supporting reactively. Inclusion, we're doing intentional things in our school, but we're also aware of the goal, which is for students to take ownership of this work themselves. All right. I'm just going to recap because I know I'm going fast here. 1, we defined SEL, a set of transferable universal skills. We unpacked it into 5 areas. We then defined inclusion, access, participation, belonging. We defined it into those 3 areas of inclusion: academic, social, and physical. The last few slides were to help you see the intersections, how we're pretty much doing the same thing with both areas of this work. So we talked about SEL and inclusion are happening or should be happening everywhere, all the places and spaces on your school site. SEL and inclusion requires us to educate, engage, and inspire all of our community stakeholders in this work. SEL and inclusion are both done intentionally and explicitly, and are also both done reactively and unintentionally. So now, how do we kind of bring this together and start to think about specific strategies that we can do? Now, before I jump into the strategies, I want to say that I hope that the previous few slides helped you think about maybe changing your own mindset or making connections that you hadn't made before. But I also see you all as ambassadors to this work to go back to your school site. So think about what maybe has sparked for you so far, but I also encourage you to think about what could you share with a colleague to help them have a greater growth mindset and start to see these connections in a different way. So a few strategies. When we're exploring self-awareness when it comes to SEL, we can't be blind to a student's disability. I think sometimes we're like, oh, we're going to explore self-awareness, but we're just going to talk about like our favorite color and our favorite cereal and if we have any pets at home. If you're a student who lives with autism, you are always going to live with autism. If you are an individual like myself who has hearing aids, I am always going to live with a hearing loss. If you are a student who lives with autism, you are always going to live with autism. We want to ensure that we celebrate and create an environment where we can talk about identity, talk about who we are, and include disability in that conversation. We need to recognize that all students have different kind of identities in life, right? So if you're a student who maybe at school, your identity is that you really want to be taken care of by the adults. Because at home, maybe your parents aren't around much, they're working night shifts, and your identity at home is that you're like the parent to your younger siblings. We need to ensure that we are teaching, reteaching, reinforcing, and reflecting emotions. Here's a big one. As adults, we tend to we tend to make it so students feel like they can only share one emotion at a time. You know, how are you feeling? I'm sad. All right, well, here's what you're going to do. You know what? We can feel more than one emotion at one time based on a scenario. So the next time you ask a student how they're feeling or what emotion they're feeling, or they point to it on the emotion wheel, I challenge you to say, are you feeling any other emotions? Give the time, give the space for them to share that. Especially our students with disabilities. They may be feeling a lot of emotions at one time. When we think about self-management, we need to ensure that the self-management strategies are relevant to a student's abilities. If there's a student who struggles with fine motor skills, probably the 5-finger breathing exercise might not be a great strategy for them to use if they're feeling big emotions. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about a student's disability and how can they still have access, participate, and belong in our SEL lessons, but in a way that is relevant to their lived experience and relevant to their abilities and or disabilities. Focusing on one strategy at a time could be really helpful. We don't want to overload our students. All right. This is probably the most important slide around strategies, and I'm watching the clock and I want to make sure we get to time for questions. We have to differentiate our SEL language in order for it to be more inclusive. SEL is an incredibly language-heavy concept. So if you are an ELL student, if you are a student who thinks very literally, if you're a student with a language-based learning disability, SEL is just going to be really hard for you to access from the beginning. And we know access is a component of inclusion. So we really want to be mindful of ensuring that we are differentiating our language as much as we can. We want to ensure that we're creating common language so we don't run into that scenario I gave of the teacher teaching 5-finger breathing and calling it 5-finger breathing, and then the yard supervisor calling it something else. So a few other things to think about. Think about what your school's goals are when it comes to inclusion. tie those goals to your SEL proactive lessons. So if one of your inclusion goals is to help students utilize the buddy bench at recess, why not tie that goal or that skill into an SEL lesson? A lot of times when we teach SEL, it's just with our students from the general education population. Make sure that our students, maybe at the SDC classroom, et cetera, are a part of those learning opportunities. Communicate these alignments. Make those connections for folks. Not everyone is going to make the connections that we made today. You have to spell it out for people. Visuals could be really helpful if your school is doing inclusion, PBIS, MTSS, SEL. It's all the same. UDL. Create some sort of visual to help your families, to help your substitute teachers, to help your teachers, to help your paraeducators see those intersections. Common language is huge, and ensuring that all staff have opportunities for training. So I know that was a lot of information. I know I tried to kind of catch up with our time. And I do know that our tummies might be grumbling because I know lunch is about to start. But that's what I wanted to share with you today. I am more than happy to take the next few minutes, however, and answer any questions we might have from Zoom or any questions we have from the audience.
Thank you for sharing everything. It was really great information, first of all. I guess my question is, how do we...
Oh, sorry.
Oh gosh, no. My question is, how do we get teachers to change their mindset? At my school, they only want to focus on SEL. They don't see that inclusion also is a part of that, and it's a huge component of it. And that's where we're at a divide. We're struggling to combine those two, because I'm a special education teacher, so I understand that inclusion is really important. But a lot of the other teachers don't see that as important and only want to focus on SEL. So what kind of strategies or suggestions, I guess, to kind of help merge those two?
I think one of the things we have to do is whatever SEL curriculum your school is using, what I would do is take the knowledge that I shared with you today, go through those units, go through the standards, go through the syllabus or the list of lessons or whatever, and with a highlighter, start to highlight, all of these connect to inclusion, right? I think you really have to spell it out. You have to be extremely explicit. And teachers oftentimes tend to be very driven or governed by the syllabus, the standards. Well, I have to start here. It's unit 1, lesson 1, and I have to go all the way to unit 10, lesson 10, right? And so start to pull out or tease for them like, hey, this actually connects to this component of inclusion. This actually connects to this inclusion of component. I would start with that. The other thing that I might utilize are books. So I don't know what grade level you're at. Okay, so elementary is great. So there are so many picture books now that feature characters with disabilities. And what I would do is look at their SEL syllabus, figure out what their units are or their goals, and then find some picture books that align to those goals, but also picture books that include characters with disabilities. And again, that's a great way to help them start to see the intersectionality without them having to create a lesson plan or print stuff out or get materials. It's like, we got a book, we got some discussion questions, we're merging discussion questions that have to do with inclusive thinking and inclusive practice, as well as SEL skill building. And while we do questions, I'm just going to throw, because I know we're probably not going to get to everything, I'm just going to throw my contact information up here again. Any other questions? Any Zoom questions? All right. Well, I want to thank you all for being here today. Reach out if I can do anything else. I'm happy to hang out for a little bit too and answer any questions one-on-one. Enjoy the rest of the day.